So let's talk a little bit about the subtypes. Now, for ease, it's like I'm calling these the 5 subtypes of imposter, but that's not quite right. So this is based on the work of Valerie Young, who wrote a book about imposter syndrome many years ago. It's a bit of an older book, and in there she identified that we all have a way that we tend to try to overcompensate for our feelings of inadequacy, to avoid being revealed as a fraud, right? And so this is what the subtypes are. They're ways that we try to prove our competence to avoid being revealed as a fraud. And so these are the 5 subtypes. The first is the perfectionist, pretty self-explanatory. Having very, very, very high standards makes you feel like you're competent and you're good enough. But of course, it's impossible to meet those standards all the time. Eventually, something slides, and then this becomes proof that you indeed are not competent or you're a fraud. Let's go to the expert next. This is me, the expert, and I have a feeling it's going to be a lot of you. The expert is the person who gets one more degree, one more class, one more CE, one more this, one more that, reads another book, listens to another podcast, etc., all as a way to fill that cup. But that cup has a hole in the bottom, and no matter how much you fill in there, it's never totally topped off. Next, we'll talk about the soloist. This is the person who feels like accomplishments only count if you're able to do it yourself, so that if you have to ask for help, this shows that you're not competent or you're a fraud. The natural genius is the person who believes that basically talent is innate. Like you either have it or you don't. And this might sound familiar, like with Carol Dweck's fixed versus growth mindset. So the natural genius is someone who has a little bit more of that fixed mindset. And so if they don't learn things the very first time, if they don't remember it, if it doesn't come easily, then this kind of proves that they're not really competent and they're a fraud. And then there's the superhuman. And this is the person that thinks like, I should be able to juggle all the balls on fire while pedaling on a unicycle, smiling, unruffled, perfectly, no problem. But of course, at some point, one of those balls will come crashing down. And this then reveals that the person is a fraud. And they think if I were truly competent, I would be able to balance spinning plates on my nose at the same time. And so that's what these are. They're ways to try to avoid revealing incompetence and fraudulence, but they tend to fall apart and do the exact thing that they're trying to avoid. Now, if you're curious about your subtype, I actually created a quiz that's, for free, that's on my website, which is just jillstoddard.com/quizzes. And you just fill out a little quiz. Don't do it during the CE, but you can always find it later. Fill it out and it'll tell you what percentage of each of these you are. Or you could even do it during the break and then report in the chat back to us, and we can see if I'm right that lots of you will be experts. Okay, so let's look at, oops, hold on, try to fast forward here. Okay, so notice how when we talked about these subtypes, it's like this cycle, right? Like I do this stuff to try to avoid feeling like a fraud, and then I create the exact outcome I'm trying to avoid. So let's take a look at the cycle. Let me also look at the time. We were going to take a break. I think we said around 1:30. Okay, so we've got about half hour. Okay, so we're gonna, this is the pattern. Then we'll look at an example. Then I want you to think about how this either applies to you or to one of your clients if you prefer. So there's some dream or goal or aspiration, something that I would like to tackle, but then my mind tells me some self-limiting belief. And I feel something that goes along with that, self-doubt, anxiety. So I engage in some type of experiential avoidance, which can be overdoing or underdoing, remember. And then what does that get me? There's a function to those behaviors. They work or we wouldn't do them. So there's some kind of relief. And then here I still am with this goal. So let's look at an example. Let's say you want to apply for a new job, or your client wants to apply for a new job. The mind says, ooh, you're not experienced enough. You don't click every single one of those boxes. There's no way they're going to want you. And so you feel anxious, you have a lot of self doubt, there's uncertainty, insecurity, and of course, these imposter thoughts and feelings. And so, what do? You put it off until you feel ready, or you take more classes or read more books so that you can confidently say you meet every one of those qualifications. And this works, right? It gets you off the hook. There's some relief. You don't have to face that fear of failure or rejection or humiliation. Your mind quiets down temporarily. But here you still are wanting to apply for this position and not moving forward with what matters to you. Hopefully, you can see how this becomes a cycle. And we could do a cycle for all of those different subtypes because there are different thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that often come with those. um, and so what we want to do is basically use ACT to break that pattern. We want to build psychological flexibility so that thoughts and feelings no longer get in the way, no longer lead to experiential avoidance, and we make choices to pursue those goals and actions based on values, not because we're being bullied by our difficult internal experiences. Okay, so the good news is, sort of good news, imposter syndrome is correlated with success. So probably the more you feel it, the more successful you are. But isn't that crazy and interesting? Like, remember I said I thought for sure if I just kept achieving it, eventually it would go away. And it doesn't. Why the heck is that? Part of it is we're doing that trying to outrun a thing, but why doesn't it work? Do you guys have any ideas about maybe why it doesn't work? It's reinforced. Yes. Well, it's reinforced like in that cycle that we just had. Absolutely. And, or maybe you can say more about that, but think about like, the CEO needs to know a lot more than the mail clerk, right? So as you work your way up and you establish those accomplishments, you're expected to know more, even if you don't feel like you're that much more of an expert than you were before. And I love the way Valerie Young puts it. She says, and now you have a reputation to defend, right? So like the more you know, the more you're expected to know. And we always care. And so remember I said like your fear is like a bright red neon arrow pointing at what you care about. If you care about contribution and competence and whatever else comes up in this environment, like of course you're going to worry about it because that is the nature of how we work. We hurt where we care, which is what Steve Hayes says. He's the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy. But the good news is, the really good news, the great news is that psychological flexibility can help with this. We don't have to wait until we feel confident or think good, positive, happy thoughts before we can move forward.